Welcome to the Earthworks Podcast, where our team will share the jargon of carbon from many of our turf friends from the past 30 years.
Hi, everybody. I'm Joel Simmons, and this is the Earthworks Podcast. And every week we come to you with some interesting tidbits, some interesting guests. And today is no exception. We have my cohort in crime, Mr. Kevin Hicks, who most of you know. And we have one of our favorites, Mr. Dave Wilber, independent consultant and friend of a very long time ago.
Hey.
If you are not a subscriber to our podcast, please be. We will send you information on what we're doing every week, and you'll get notification of some wonderful things. Today, the three of us are going to talk about a subject matter that I think is a bit confusing for a lot of folks, especially in the turf industry, and one that probably is a little bit of a challenge. We're going to spend today talking about the water report, and Dave has agreed to spend some time with us as we throw questions his way and talk about what the water report looks like. How do you kind of get through it all? How do you make sense of it? And I guess, Dave, probably the best thing to do is, first of all, thank you for joining us. As you know, You are one of our favorite guests and one of our most popular guests, and it's always a pleasure. And for those of you who haven't heard the three of us before, I would not have met Mr. Hicks if it wasn't for Dave Wilber, and of course, Kevin now being very integral to our organization. So there's a strong old connection going here on this triad of ours today. But let's dive into this. I think probably the best place to start, Dave, is we're going to get into the numbers, but let's talk about how do you actually pull a water sample? I mean, what's the best strategy of getting that done?
Yeah, Joel. Well, I mean, first of all, thanks for having me, you guys, and I'm honored. I'm honored. I think the way that we had a little brief meeting the other day talking about getting this together, and it was pretty clear to me that, the way I thought it might be fun to approach this is just to look at it from, having been the guy who's delivered, literally thousands of water reports, to golf course superintendents, and you guys, doing the same, right? Thousands of soil reports, thousands of water reports.
Do we really understand them?
Yeah. Is what is the key to understanding this information? Because so many times I would get to, especially somebody that I had never worked with before or whatever, you get to their office and out comes the big binder, full of tests. And it really doesn't, it's not the tool that it could be. It's almost like they've picked the box and said, well, I have to get a test.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Certainly it's that way with soil tests. With water tests, it's even worse because if they have them, it's confusing, and usually a lot of times they don't have them. Why would I test my water?
Yeah,
I don't need to do that. It is what it is.
Yeah. Right? And I can't change it, generally speaking. I'm not in a position to afford or want to or understand how to change it, and so why bother testing?
Right? Why bother and all that sort of stuff. So I think what I hope that we get accomplished today is obviously some good technical discussion about what this water report means, why to do it, what you can do with the information when you have it, and how to best understand potentially the changes or the seasonal changes that happen in your waters, and why to continue to monitor that. And then the last thing, and I think which is the key thing, is understanding that really it's your biggest input.
Right.
It's the thing that you have more control over in a way than anything else. And often, especially in the case of poor quality waters, it is your biggest application, as far as the bad stuff that could be in that water.
It's your biggest red flag, right?
Absolutely.
And it affects everything. It affects the soil. It affects your spray tanks. It affects everything. And we don't understand it all that well, quite honestly. And I can't tell you how many times I go into a client's office and we review soil tests, and they may not have run a water test in 5 years.
Yeah.
And it's stunning that we just haven't done a good job, I guess, from our end in helping people really discover the real value of what this data is all about. So that's why we're here.
Honestly,
that's why you're here.
Going back a number of years, in my own case, you stop at the first line on the test and you go, I guess I'm in the range. I'm good.
Yeah.
right? Number one. And number two, who taught us how to read them?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Like you said, it's in the binder, check the box, but it didn't do what it should be able to do for us.
It's that tool that is potentially a great tool that is hidden away, and it shouldn't be. It should be part of your daily thinking and conversation. So that's what I want to do. So Joel, you said, you mentioned sampling, which is
Let's start with that.
Yeah, it's the first key to the success of the whole thing.
Yeah.
And let's say, if you're listening to this in whatever situation you're in, you're holding a sample bottle. I thought I had one here somewhere. I have a Scotch bottle, but that's not going to work.
No, don't use that. Or your spittoon bottle. Don't use that either.
Yeah, no. I've got my protein shaker. But anyway, you're holding a water bottle, and it's like, okay, what do I do? How do I sort out, what's happening? And so the first thing is let's just make a quick delineation between if you're on a reclaimed water source, versus anything else that isn't reclaimed. So potable water, well water, all that sort of stuff. But reclaimed water is a different animal.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason it's a different animal is because there's a gas exchange process that goes on when they do tertiary treatment. There's some additives there to control the bacteria, right? The human health side of it. And they are continuing to react. So if you're a reclaimed water user, the first step is you got to get 2 of those bottles.
Right.
Right? And the first one is going to get filled from a quick coupler or, a reclaimed source, wherever. And it's going to get capped right away and left on your desk. The second sample is a little more, it's not tricky, but it's got to be thought through, is you're going to grab that sample in a small bucket or something like that and let it sit open. Just open.
For how long?
24 hours is best. A minimum of 12.
And we're talking reclaimed water.
Yeah, reclaimed water only.
And what you're trying to do is you're trying to gas off whatever is in there.
Yeah. And then you're going to take that bottle and pull a sample out of that bucket and cap it. Now, why? So the example is kind of like the can of Coca-Cola. When I first open the can, it's fizzing, right? It's respirating. There's gases in there.
Off gassing.
Yeah, and if I stick a pH meter in there, it's going to be, kind of acidic, right? Well, after, an hour, 2 hours or whatever, the gases are gone. The Coke is flat now, and it has a different pH. And the reason I'm telling this story is because it fits into some other things that we're going to talk about later. But the sugars and all the junk that's in the Coca-Cola is still there, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But you're going to get 2 different readings with that one thing, with the pH thing. So with reclaimed water, because it's still respirating, you've got to pull 2 samples and compare those.
So you're sending both samples in.
You're sending both samples in. So you guys that are running reclaim, sorry, but it's it's double the work, but it's worth it. There's some differences that happen in that water, and we don't want to make decisions until we've seen both sides of that picture.
So which one more closely mirrors what's actually hitting the ground through an irrigation head?
Probably the second one, Kevin.
The off gas.
That's been gassed off.
Yeah, if you had to pick, and one of the people that I learned this technique from just used to say, just pull a reclaim sample and let it respirate in the bucket, and then pull 1 sample. We've learned to pull 2 just so that we can illustrate the differences.
Okay.
Especially for people that are, fertigating and doing some different stuff like that. It's like, what is that water like when it first comes out of the pipe to me? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. So let's go back to basic sampling technique, though. If I'm just a regular guy on a well or on a thing, what am I doing? I've always told people to pull it off as close to the grass as they can. Does that make sense?
Right. That's a great place to start. And the only time that doesn't really work is if we have some drastically different sources. Let's say that you've got a well that only gets used when you're really starting to run out of water. And you've got another water source like the runoff water or the creek or whatever that runs through the golf course. we probably want to know about both of those sources.
Right.
But from a practicality standpoint, and this is where we'll lead into the seasonal thing. From a practicality standpoint, you're going to want to use whatever is coming to the grass. So I always like to go to that quick coupler or that valve or whatever that's farthest away from the pumping point or from the lake or whatever, clear across the golf course, pull a sample there.
A lot of guys will go and dip into the pond. Does that make sense?
Dipping into the pond is okay, but you run the risk of sampling the pond scum and the stuff that's flying in the air that gets to the top. So if you do that, and there's nothing wrong with dipping in the pond, if you do that, you've got to kind of hold the bottle. I'm not going to do it with a Scotch bottle, but you've got to hold the bottle upside down and get it way under the water and then tip it and let it draw,
right?
Not from the top. Don't scoop it from the top, because that can really make a difference.
Here's another question, Dave, that's similar to this before we get into the actual numbers. How frequently do you recommend a golf course superintendent or sports turf manager to test? How frequently during the season?
So there's no question that water quality changes through the course of the season.
Right.
Wells draw down, things change and all that sort of stuff. There's a great story. Lou Tonelli, golf course superintendent from the Lake Merced Club near San Francisco. I think Lou was there longer than I was alive when I was working with him. I mean,
he was.
He started it, before I was born. But Lou told me one time, because we were talking about when to pull samples, and he said, right around September, they start to call me, and he was working mostly on well water at that point. They call me from the clubhouse and tell me the sprinklers are messing up the windows and they can't get them clean. Happens about September, he said. Right?
And this is well water.
This is well water.
Right.
And in the same couple of sentences, he also said that, towards the end of the season, his water is a little more tricky because 2 of his wells aren't producing as much as they would in the spring.
Yeah. And just so people know where Lou was at in the San Francisco Bay Area, real close to the San Francisco Club and the Olympic Club. So that area of the world.
In a place where it doesn't rain all summer.
Right. Exactly.
It might get foggy, but you're not going to get much measurable rain. So Lou knew intuitively that his water changed, and he knew when it changed because that's when they called him from the clubhouse and told him that the windows were, and they had to go up with the special acid wash and get the bicarbonate off the windows. Right? Go. Okay. So that's a hint. Well water quality is going to change. Runoff water quality is going to change. Salts are going to concentrate. So, I want people to test at the beginning and the end of their season.
Well, and likewise, one of the tests we're going to look at, he's got a very high influx of treated effluent water during the winter months.
Right.
And then he switches over to surface sources in the summer because there's nobody there. There's snowbirds and they've gone home.
Because it's the opposite climate thing.
Right.
Exactly.
And the same thing happens with normal city waters is that they'll treat them harder in the summer months because, it's higher potential for contaminants. So there's more chlorine in city water in the summer months.
Correct.
Tell me if I'm wrong with this, Dave, but for years I've been talking, especially new clients that I don't know their soil profiles or their water tests. I like to run 4 tests, spring, summer, fall, and then the winter test, at least that first year, so that we can kind of get it. What it does for the conversation that we're having with the superintendent is it gives us that opportunity to say, this is the changes that you're going to see happening. So be ahead of the curve and understand that, when you get into June, July, and August in the heat of the summer, things are a little bit different than what you were. I also remember vividly Susan Chainer calling me in say February, and she ran a number of water samples and they were so clean. And it turned out what it was literally snow melt. So water changes. It changes.
Water changes. It changes from, where it comes from. The other thing I think people do sometimes is they'll go pull that springtime sample when they first turn on their wells, if they're on well water.
Good.
And actually, you got to run those for a week or so.
Yeah.
Before you pull that, sample, because a lot, that water can just be sitting there.
Yeah.
All winter down deep, and there's some concentrations that happen there. We've seen that before. We've definitely seen early spring water tests out of a well that looked like, oh my God, this is scary. And then pull another sample a couple weeks later just to double check ourselves, and it's okay. This is what we
flushed
expect.
itself through. Yeah, that makes. I never even thought of that. That's brilliant. Let me ask you this question real quick. We obviously here at Earthworks work with Logan, but aren't most laboratories running very similar test methodologies? I mean, I know soil tests can vary from lab to lab, but I have found, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I've always thought that most laboratories, commercial laboratories, the water sampling is fairly consistent. Am I wrong at that?
You're not wrong in that at all, Joel. What changes drastically is just the reporting.
Gotcha.
You know, what they report and all that sort of stuff. And I definitely have some things, and I think we'll get to it when we go through the test today about what needs to be on a report that's going to help us in
right. Well,
the other thing is, I mean, just to say that, a lot of times a reclaimed water provider or even a city water provider will say, well, we've got tests, right? And they'll send the superintendent something and say, this is good enough. But what that's all about is what we call Title 22. It's all about human contaminants, right? It's all about the things they have to do to be regulated. It means very little for agronomic suitability.
So that's a great point, and I'm glad you brought that up. I would have forgot that as well, but I get that often in that they get what I call the Hollywood sample, but it's not an agricultural sample.
No.
It's a potability sample, and a lot of guys, unfortunately, they'll look at that and say, "Oh yeah, no, my water's pretty clean. They sent me this sample."
They've all got pH on them. They've all got some TDS on them, and some things like that. So it looks like the thing, but it's not the thing. And if you go to a lot of labs websites or whatever, they'll have a agricultural suitability. I guess what I'm getting to is you don't want the water test that the guys selling the water softeners like to look at.
Exactly. Yeah. Or the pool guys, the guys that are running your pool water. You don't want that test. That's a pH test.
Or the guys that are running reclaimed water and they don't want anybody to get sick. We don't, we're not looking for, that kind of testing. So agricultural suitability in the lab world is the key phrase.
I keep coming up with questions for you before we get into the detail where we really want to be, but I just thought of another one. I've often said this to some guys on especially on the reclaimed water. Is there any flexibility within the superintendent's realm to be able to talk to the reclaimed water people and say, can you clean this up at all? Can you make this a little bit better? This is killing me. I mean, is there a way they can go and talk to somebody down at the plant and say, stop it?
It's funny because Joel, I always tell superintendents that are taking reclaimed, I always ask them one of my Columbo kind of questions, because I think a good consultant asks a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Is I'll say, what's your relationship like with your water provider?
Good.
And some superintendents will say, oh yeah, I know those guys at the plant, and we talk every once in a while when they're going to slow down or when they're going to speed up or when they need that kind of thing. The worst answer is, no, I don't know anything about that. I just I turn on the valve, the water comes out. I don't know those guys. But the thing is that there's a bunch of different ways now. There's three main methods that they disinfect that water with. There's a sodium chloride product, there's a calcium chloride product. It's sodium hypochlorite and calcium hypochlorate, or vice versa. It doesn't matter. But there's a calcium-oriented product, there's a sodium-oriented product, and there's ultraviolet. Obviously, the ultraviolet has no chemical for disinfection. Yeah. It is the best.
Nice would that be? Yeah.
It's also really expensive.
Yeah, right, and not used very often.
And older plants and out-of-the-way places are not going to have the UV thing.
Yeah.
The newer standard is really UV. It's it has an operating cost only in power. You're not buying barrels of chemical. You're not dealing with totes of chemical or whatever, and injection rates and contact time and all that. Those guys work in that world. There's formulas for how much contact time. If I'm running the plant this fast, I have to use this much chemical in order to get this much contact time. And you can definitely have conversations with them about what they're using as a disinfectant and tell them, man, I'm really sodium sensitive. I'm really salt sensitive. I'm super sodium sensitive in my turf grass. Can we talk about that? And a lot of times what you're doing is it's the same thing as you would be doing when you need a new mower or when you need something else, is you're helping this person write a case to his bosses and say, hey, we can do better for our downstream customer.
I had a conversation not long ago with a client who got to know his water guy, and he found out that the water guy was a golfer. And so he befriended him and said,
Perfect.
"Hey, come over. I'll play a few rounds of golf. Let's become friends."
Yeah.
And things started to change to his betterment. It was wonderful how quickly that can
It's
happen.
amazing what a round of golf and a clubhouse sandwich can do
Exactly. It was wonderful. He said things got really better all of a sudden because I got to know the guy and, found out that he liked golf, and it was great.
Yeah. So I think that's really key, Joel, is the important part of things is understanding those providers. I mean, you are the customer. I know a lot of these municipalities don't have that concept that you're a customer. It's just like take it or leave it and shut up. But there are conversations around all that.
Yeah, and you made the point, Dave, in our little team seminar that there have been cases where that switch to from total chemical to UV have been presented, and they're all over it because of the exposure or lack thereof. If they can make that switch, it's a safety factor. It's all those things.
Yeah, I mean, if you see a tote of sodium hypochlorite, the badging on that thing, I mean, it's hazmat. We're talking about a full-on hazmat thing, right? It's OSHA. It's gee, if this if that hose leaks, we got a problem here. Kind of thing. And believe me, the municipal people don't want to deal with that. So
and the township or the county or the whoever, the authority, exactly. That's liability.
Help you.
I remember talking to a guy once, and he said to a water plant guy once, and he said, I've been trying to get the city and everybody to understand that the UV thing is the way to go. I just haven't had enough ammunition. And I said, well, let me write you a letter. And not only we do that, but we got a few of the local clubs that were on that, on that particular system to write good letters to the city council, or I guess it was the town public works director who it went to first. And this guy's an engineer, right? And he sees the math and goes, oh, okay. Yeah, let me take that to city council. And I think in that particular case, it was about $200,000 for them to switch to UV, but they were spending $400,000 a year on chemical.
Oh, well, that answers that question, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's kind of round numbers, but
even so, even if it's a 5-year return on investment, I mean, and there's got to be some good public relations involved in having that conversation.
Sure, absolutely.
All right, let's get into the the water test, and walk through this. In our format of podcast, we're going to have to do this audioly and go through this. But the first section of the water test, as you look at it, and again, I'm using the Logan Labs test, is pH, hardness grains, conductivity, and sodium absorption ratio. Obviously, the first line is pH. Unfortunately, maybe I should say the first line is pH. But talk to us about, what are we looking at when we see this? We're all looking at a test that happens to have a very high pH of 9.2. But when you see that, I mean, what should your mind be thinking when a grower sees pH?
Well, again, when I'm getting to know somebody, I want to know what they see in their world. And so when we start to talk about a water test, I'll go, well, tell me about your water, right? Or tell me about the recent test you got. And it may be in the binder and it doesn't, may not. And the first thing a superintendent will always say is, well, the pH is.
Yeah. High pH or whatever.
Right. And then the next level of that, the next tier is the superintendent that calls me and says, I have pH problems. Right.
Yeah.
I have pH issues. And of course, people always want to capitalize, in marketing, they tell you, show somebody their problem and then give them a solution.
Right.
So here, Mr. Superintendent has got a problem and he wants the solution. Right. And so then we're going to talk that through. So everybody kind of knows the pH scale, right? They know that, that acidic is bad and basic is bad. And I want to be in the middle. But the thing about water pH is it's really dependent on all the anions and cations that are hanging out in the water. Mm-hmm. And so I can have a water that's really like a runoff water, like you said, that's going to show me a very high pH because it has, just some kind of, some calcium, magnesium in it, not a lot of salts. Yeah. And that pH pen, is not going to read a lot of information, right? It's just, and so literally a little bit of acid could swing that clear to the other end. It could be 9.2 today and 7.2, the next day, right? And
it can swing that fast, really?
Oh yeah, in clean waters like that, because really, Joel, you've been great. Kevin, you've been great. I would like to hope I've been great in speaking to people about exchange capacity.
Yeah.
A sand is not going to hold the mineral that a clay is.
Right.
I think we all kind of get that, right? Strong magnet, weak magnet. Well, it's the same thing in water.
Mm-hmm.
Some waters are very strong holders, and there's a whole bunch of mineral there, and some waters are not. Some are very clean, and they're kind of that low exchange capacity. So the pH is very misleading, And when I'm talking to somebody and they start off with pH and they want to solve their problems about pH and everything, I just we got to have a talk.
So what do you say? What do you tell them?
Well, I just say, listen, let's look and see what's driving that pH.
Right.
And let's talk about water, in a different way. And that's usually when I bring up and this is why we have pounds per acre foot or pounds per acre inch on a agricultural suitability test, right? This is what they won't have, at the water company.
Right.
They don't care about acres, or 1,000 square feet or whatever, but we have that on the test. And so, when you look at this and you say, okay, here's my salt concentration. And on the particular test we're looking at, it says 100 pounds per acre inch, and again, I can have another test sitting right next to it that's going to be, 500 pounds per acre inch.
Right.
That's a difference. And that pH at that point really becomes, it's not really a good number.
It's insignificant almost, right?
It's insignificant.
You said something that I actually got a call from a client yesterday. The question is not what is the pH, but what's driving it. And we've been using that phrase. I'm sure I stole that from you years ago. I actually got a call from a client yesterday, and he said, I went to one of your seminars and I always never really understood this until you said, don't look at the pH, ask the question, why is the pH what it is?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's the answer to pH.
Exactly.
On both soils and water.
I think, Dave, you taught me this, that pH, whether you're talking soils or water, is an effect, not a cause.
Exactly.
Right?
So, I used to use the example for people. It's like, I go to the doctor, the nurse, they're checking you out before you go in. You're going to get your blood pressure checked and everything. She sticks a thermometer in your mouth. I guess now, she shoots the gun at your head.
Don't do that anymore, yeah.
Sticks something in your ear or whatever. And it says a number, right? And let's say, I don't feel well. I go to the doctor. The thermometer says, 101. Well, yeah, I'm sick. But it doesn't say why. It doesn't say,
or what.
It doesn't say if I have an infection or a bronchitis or, what, right?
Well,
it says, hey, something's wrong.
That's a great analogy.
It is a great analogy.
It's a number at that point.
Yeah. So, okay. So I see a pH of 9.2. I want to figure that out. I want to do the diagnostics now. I've been alerted that there may be something wrong. It may not be, right? Dave may just sat in a sun lamp in a hot car before he walked in the doctor's office.
Right. And often does, by the way.
I don't really, but I have a sun or whatever. But I'm just saying, it's like, it's just a quick diagnostic tool, and it doesn't mean a lot of things. The sad part is that pH got used for a lot of things in the scientific community to determine when we do what. With soils, it goes back to, when the government was giving away lime, the farmer had to have a pH test of their soil, whether they got the free lime or not.
Right.
Which was what a huge mistake.
So we lime only for one purpose,
not
to bring calcium to the soil, but because of pH.
And it's the same thing. Let's say that, that we're trying to make a decision about acid or sulfur burning or whatever. And we go, okay, here's my pH, right? So that must mean I set the sulfur burner or I set the acid injector at a certain setting just based on the pH. What a huge mistake.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it's a real easy measurement. There's lots of different ways you can measure it. It's from a pH pen to a piece of litmus paper or whatever. It's a very easy thing to come up with info.
And it's easy to mess up too, by the way, especially, if you're not calibrated properly. I mean, it gets to be very confusing. And like you said, there's so much more on this piece of paper. That was always been my issue, is that, you stop at that one line and you say, do you realize there's 30 other lines on this piece of paper that are all affecting this?
Right. So if we keep going down that first section, Joel, the hardness, the grains and the grains per gallon, the reason that's usually on an agricultural suitability test really is for people that are dependent on drip irrigation and whether or not their drip emitters and stuff like that are really going to work and how that all goes. We don't really pay that much attention to that. At a certain point, you start to figure out this is kind of a hard water, this isn't a hard water, that sort of thing. But it's not those two numbers really, they're used in general agriculture, but not so much in turf.
I heard somebody talking about it recently, and that brought some more. I honestly wish I remembered exactly what they were talking about, but it became a conversation point. But I don't remember. I shouldn't even bring it up because I don't remember the bloody conversation. But anyway, let's move on. Conductivity.
Yeah. So conductivity really, this is so it goes back to that exchange capacity thing that I was talking about. A higher conductive water means that I have more ions. If I took a TV picture of my water column, I can have a few ions or I can have a whole bunch.
Right.
And that's really what the conductivity is telling us, is this conductant.
How much stuff is in the water? Is that a easy layman's way to say
how many ions in the water? We're gonna quantify that a little bit more with PDS, or salt concentration.
Right. Now, and this happens to be on our test, certainly Logan, it's millimoles per centimeter. Is that relevant? And oftentimes I get the question, what does that even mean? What there's some different ways to express it. Like I think on the POGOs and the TDRs, it's in micromoles, which means it's different than what you would see on this test or any other test.
Yeah. So you just need to know. It's just a conversion.
Okay. It's a mathematical conversion. It
is, and it's also decisiemens per liter.
Yeah.
Right. So that's how that works. It's easy to find the conversions. There's little tools, in fact, on a bunch of different websites. If I put in my micromoles, it'll spit out all the rest.
Okay.
So yeah.
So for the most part, we're not paying too much attention to that either.
Again, if we see something there that is a big number, like 2 point something or whatever, that's essentially 2,000 on the TDR.
Yeah.
That's a real number.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
And likewise, if it's, my last golf course usually ran about 0.05.
Right. Which means there's no conductance.
Which means there's nothing in it.
Which means this water is hungry.
Yeah.
Right.
Hopefully we'll get into that, because you had a great story about that.
Oh, what your water? Yeah, we'll get into that for sure. Let's do that when we get down the page a little bit.
Okay. All right, next one, sodium absorption ratio. Let's talk about that.
Sodium adsorption, right? The word is adsorption.
Correct.
And adsorption basically means what can stick to the outside. It's not like the sponge is what's a sponge
absorption as opposed to adsorption.
A soil particle has ways to have things grab onto it. And so that number basically says how much sodium is here, what is the potential for it to hold on to my soil, right? And why do we care about that? Because sodium is this small molecule that can swell up to be this big puffy thing that can seize a soil and seal a soil, right? That's it.
Yeah.
So that's why we care about sodium adsorption, because we function in a world where roots need pore space, water needs to go through the soil, all that sort of stuff, right?
So when we're talking about that, Dave, we tend to focus a lot on biology. Would that also give us an indication that sodium levels are high enough to cause some negative effect on soil biology?
Absolutely, because again, if it's adsorbing, if it's sticking
there,
then I've got my friends and my microbes, hanging out with salts. It's not going to be a good show.
Yeah.
Is there a point at which on that number, is there a point at which that makes you sit up and take notice of it?
Probably for me, 4 or 5, but we're going to get to, because again, something drives that number.
Sure.
Right? Here we go again. Something drives that number. And I want to know a little bit more about what drives that number. And there's
so what
another,
you're saying then, Dave, is that these top five numbers should really be on the bottom because they're the sum of other stuff.
in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
SAR is a calculation. It's a mathematical calculation, and it
And
shows us the potential of that soil to have a sodium hazard.
Yeah, and it's the square root of the other ions and stuff. I mean, it's a silly
calcium, magnesium over.
Yeah, it's algebra. And but what I'm gonna show you guys today is on all of the tests that I run, I want an adjusted SAR on that test. And everybody will say to me, why adjusted SAR? So we're gonna jump to the bottom of the page right now.
Go ahead, do that. That's good.
What does adjusted SAR mean? Adjusted SAR means that it's adjusted for the presence of carbonates and bicarbonates in that system, right? If I have a bicarbonate there, I'm going to have a higher rate of adsorption. That makes sense?
Yeah.
So what I'm looking at here, I'm looking at the test that we're looking at, and it has an SAR, a regular SAR of 9.21, and it has an adjusted SAR of 10.12. So it went up because I have some salts, I have some bicarbonate there. And it says, not only is this got kind of an issue with sodium being there, but it's also more of an issue because of what form the sodium's in, which is sodium bicarbonate, which is a harder, tougher bond to break.
Harder to get out.
Yeah, exactly. Harder to get off. I want to flocculate or deflocculate that soil. Sorry. Yeah.
Well, are you suggesting that because of these numbers, you're going to actually have more deposit of sodium into the soil?
It's not as much depositing as it's hanging on, Joel. Because again, it comes down to that little molecule that swells up for that big amount of water, And let's take that one step further. We talk about sodium-induced drought stress. That's exactly where that comes from.
Yeah.
So if I have an SAR, let's just say over 5, whatever number it is, and it goes up a couple of points because of the adjusted SAR, well, I know I have a situation where sodium-induced drought stress, because of the sodium bicarbonates there, can be an issue.
And this is one thing that I definitely learned from you over the years. And I talk about sodium-induced wilt often. I often say things to the effect that I think it could be the first limiting factor in growing quality grass. Because if you're going to always be flushing sodium into the cell, it's going to dehydrate, it's going to wilt. It's essentially like a high blood pressure on that turf grass. And now we can identify it fairly effectively by understanding some of these numbers.
Right. So let's say that I have a water that not only has a significant amount of SAR, but it also changes a whole bunch on the adjusted SAR, goes up.
Yeah.
Right. I want to look at that and I want to say, hey, this might be the water that I don't want to just go spritz with. This is not the water to go out with at 2:00 in the afternoon on a hot day and try to convince myself that I'm doing something.
That was one of the questions I wrote down, is talk about the relationship between how we irrigate with these type of waters.
Yeah, because adsorption also happens on the leaf blade.
Right.
And I've had those phone calls. Guys will say, "Wow, I went out to hand water and the greens turned white."
Right.
Huh?
Yeah.
Or the
I've actually had a superintendent tell me that he thinks he has powdery mildew on his bent grass. And I'm like, I don't think you do.
Right.
So let's look at your water. Let's look at your soil test. Oh, look at this.
Yeah. Okay. So let's stop with the SAR and adjusted SAR thing, because, again, what we're doing is we're getting a snapshot. Hey, what does this look like? What's driving it? And all that sort of thing. So now we want to go look at the cations and the anions, the plus and minus charges. So calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, iron, those things are all going to be on the test. And if I look at that on this particular test, Joel, I don't know if you guys are going to end up putting this up or not, but it doesn't really matter, because what I see is in parts per million, I'm looking at parts per million here. It's like 12, 2, 3, and then bang, sodium, 134.
Right. The bus is full with sodium, folks.
I don't need a chart to say what number should this be.
Yeah.
To look at that and go, wow, something's out of whack here.
The word of the day is preponderance.
A preponderance of the mineral here that I see is sodium, right? So that's a positive charge, right? Sodium, positive charge, cation. Well, cations have got to have, they got to have marriage to an anion. So I'm looking at this and I'm saying, well, that's a bunch of sodium. I wonder what form that sodium's in. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's in, if I look down the page a little bit further, and total alkalinity just gives us, how much of that, that's that exchange capacity thing. So we can glance past that and we can look and we see, wow, look at this. I have a bunch of bicarbonate here.
Yeah.
And I have a bunch of sulfate.
Mm-hmm.
So I have sodium sulfate and sodium bicarbonate in my world. Okay. And we want to essentially prove that number or support that number by what's known as TDS, or salt concentration, on some tests or whatever. And now we're seeing, of our total salts, which in this particular case, our salt concentration is 467. Our total dissolved salts on some tests, TDS, right? I'm going to say that is 467. Okay, so of that 467, how much of that is anions? A bunch of it, right?
Bunch of it.
Let me just qualify this so people are following us. Under this test, it says salt concentration. That is a TDS.
That's TDS.
Okay, and that's that. Just so that people are following us and on what we're talking about.
It can be expressed either way.
Right.
Right. So salt concentration, TDS.
Total dissolved solids.
Salts, not solids.
Excuse
salts.
me, I misspoke.
Yeah, that's okay. I do it all the time.
Often.
I do it too.
I do
really,
it often.
It's a huge mistake on my part to say that. It's total dissolved salts.
Salts.
Right? So dissolved means what?
In solution.
In solution, right? So if I take, let's say that I take a pan of water, of my irrigation water, and set it in the sun and let it evaporate, what's left?
The salts.
Right. The salts don't go up in the air with the, with the H, the 2s, and the O's.
Yeah.
They're here. So every water's got a concentration of some kind of salt. That's just
Dave. Let me take you back a step just so we can qualify. I'm looking at the test, and similar to what most labs look at, under the cations, you've got ppms, parts per million. You've got milliequivalents per liter, and then you've got the pounds per acre.
Right.
What are we looking at? Where do we want to put our eyes? And explain the differences.
Well, again, okay, so we'll get back to why pounds per acre inch is so important, but ppm is concentration, right? It's parts per million,
right.
Parts per billion, or whatever.
In this case, million, yeah.
Yeah, that's just concentration. And a mentor of mine always used to say the solution to pollution is dilution, because what you want to do is you want to take that 100 ppm and turn it into 100 ppb, right? Parts per billion.
Thin it down.
And how do you do that? Right? So that's the scientific world works on that idea of concentration, right? The milliequivalents, every one of those minerals has a different molecular weight, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the milliequivalent says how many milliequivalents, how many molecular weight equivalences, milliequivalents per liter are in there. And why that's important is all these numbers, the calculated numbers like adjusted SAR and stuff are all based on milliequivalents. They're based on the weight of that mineral.
Yeah.
The atomic number, if you will.
I use an example in a lot of talks where you'd have basketballs and ping pong balls.
Right.
100 is not always 100.
100 is not always 100, and that's exactly what that's trying to quantify. And then remember I said weight, right? Then you take that into pounds per acre inch. So what? An acre foot is 326,000 gallons of water. An acre inch is divide that by 12. I don't know. I don't have my calculator on my desk.
27,000.
27,000. Good job, Kevin. So in 27,000 gallons, I have, that's what that is. So it's not how many pounds you put over an acre there. It's just how many pounds are in this, X number of gallons of water, right? And it uses acre. The agricultural standard is acre inches, acre feet. Yeah. So that's how we talk about it.
When we're looking at this particular test that the three of us are looking at, I mean, it jumps out. I'm looking at, like you said, ppms, 12, 2, 3, and then 134. I mean, it just screams at you as to why is pH what it is, and why is SAR what it is. I mean, everything is just jumping out.
Okay, so think think like a consultant now. So I see that bigger number, and then my eyes go across to the pounds per acre inch. And what did we just say? 27,000 gallons, I have 30 pounds of elemental sodium sitting there.
So every time you're irrigating, you're putting out tons of sodium.
Okay. So let's look at a 1,000,000 gallon night.
Right.
Which is not uncommon here in the Western United States for many of us, where it doesn't rain a lot, right? Nearly 3 acre feet. Right, Kevin? Are you checking me out on this?
I am.
3 acre feet. So that's 30 pounds per acre inch. I want to take 30 times 12. That gives me my pounds per acre foot. And then I just use 3 of them that night.
And tomorrow I'll do the same. And Wednesday I'll do the same. And Thursday I'll do the same.
Yeah. So we have a golf course that's using, say, 300 acre feet a year, 400 acre feet per year. You start to do the math on this, and you start to see we're talking truckloads of sodium going into that golf course.
And like you said, in between every irrigation cycle, you're running an ET of 0.3, 0.4, and all that is doing is concentrating those salts in those soils, right? Because the water is evaporating and the salts
stays behind.
Yeah.
So what
happens, right? And it happens at different rates in different places. Obviously, when the humidity is higher in the air, we don't get as much evaporative cooling, right? The swamp cooler works better in the Western U.S. than it does in Louisiana,
right?
But it still works. You still get, the cool breeze still dries things out, right?
Let me state the really blatantly obvious, just for sake of argument. That much sodium is obviously affecting the soil structure. It's deflocculating the structure. It's going to affect the plant. It's going to dehydrate the plant. It's going to affect the root hair. It's going to affect the root. But also, don't forget, it's also completely damaging soil biology, mycorrhizae in the root zone, beneficial bacteria and fungi. None of these guys are doing well in that environment. So, getting buffers into that system when you see this kind of water is incredibly important. And what I mean by buffers, obviously, is making sure we've got some level of carbon in there to kind of absorb it and to kind of build back some of the biology and to kind of soak some of it up, if you will. But these are the big factors that you're seeing when you see this kind of water. And it's not uncommon. Even here on the East Coast, we see numbers that look similar to this, maybe not quite as bad as what you guys are dealing with on the West, but we got some sodium.
Okay, so and so now let's this is perfect, Joel. This is the perfect segue into what I want to talk about classifying water a little bit, because at the end of the day, a lot of this is about how the water gets in the ground.
Right.
Sure.
Does it sit on top, or does it go on in? And if it does, what does it go on in with? What is it bringing to the table? If I think about a graph, going up one way and down the other, I'm looking at my camera backwards. Up one side we could have sodium, right? And the other side we could, or sodicity, you should say. And the other side we could have salinity, right? They're kind of two different things. Sodium's in play, sodicity, salinity, but saline water, is a different kind of salty than that high bicarbonate, kind of water that turns your skin gray,
right.
Water. And so it's really important to know what you're dealing with. Okay, I have conductivity here. I have all that. Is it a sodic water or a saline water? And sometimes, so let's say I have the sodic water, right? And my SAR is high. It's climbing up towards 10. And my salinity, there's not a lot of chlorides. There's not a lot of sulfates here. Not a lot, right? Certainly no chloride. Sodium chloride is what? Seawater.
Yeah.
Okay. So we deal with that a lot of times when we're near a coastal environment or, Hawaii and the lowlands. And, is this
even along the East Coast? I mean, it's
absolutely.
We see that a lot here.
Swamp water, that kind of thing. Seawater intrusion, saltwater intrusion into wells, that are near things, or just salty wells. We can have very kind of, saline wells in some places, right? So I want to know, am I dealing with salinity or sodicity? Yeah. And if I'm dealing with sodium oriented sodicity kind of thing, adding a little bit of salinity to this water isn't necessarily a bad thing. So a water like the one that we've been talking about today, I can add some salinity through the form of like a gypsum, you know, and do what we call heavying up the water on the good side, and it helps draw it into the ground. Now I've got calcium and some sulfate, and it, you know, and I'm battling against all that heavy concentration of sodium. So we could look at a water like this and say, well, we can go out and put some gypsum on the ground, which is not a bad thing. We can inject some gypsum, which is not a bad thing. We just need to know how much we can put, you know, how much this water, you know, really needs. So there's calculations about that, and that's where some of the numbers on this page get to.
Right. Let's keep rolling, because I fear we're going to run out of time here. But let's get into that last section, or the second to last section, actually. Bicarbonates, carbonates.
So
you broached some of it, but let's talk carbonates and bicarbonates.
So we're talking about the things that drive alkalinity, sodicity, and salinity, and so that's what that last section kind of is all about, right? You know, do I have carbonates or bicarbonates? Rarely do we see carbonates, you know, in water. In some places you see it, but bicarb, you know, sodium bicarb is what we're dealing with in this situation. Alka-Seltzer,
right?
You know, for lack of a better term, baking soda. That's what we've got here. And so, you know, we go, okay, I see, you know, I have my positive charges, my cations, calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, and I have some negatives, right? Carbonate, bicarbonate, chloride, sulfate. I want to see how everybody's kind of coming to the party here. So it looks like in this particular water, we have some bicarbonates and we have some sulfates. So, but we still go back to, we have the preponderance of sodium ions driving the bus. So I've got sodium sulfate and sodium, you know, and sodium bicarbonate. Both of those are kind of tough bonds. You know, those are both, you know, they're bringing a lot of stuff to the table. So if I can, Joel, we'll just skip down to my favorite number on any water test.
Do it.
Which is pHc.
Right. Explain that.
pHc is a measure of the pH adjusted for the effects of carbonates and bicarbonates in a water. And so here's the thing to know. Here's the key thing, right? Listeners, everybody, this is the takeaway on the pHc thing. On the regular pH scale, 7 is the center. On the pHc scale, 8.4 is the center. Anything lower than 8.4 is going to strip away calcium because it's hungry for it. Those carbonates and those bicarbonates, they're hungry for more than what they've got in this. Anything higher than 8.4 is going to deposit, or what we say, precipitate calcium.
And this is specific to calcium.
We look at it that way just because, hey, what do I want to do here to combat this whole situation? I already told you that we could add some salinity in the form of gypsum, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm also looking at a pHc that says, man, this thing is stripping away calcium. It's keeping us from deflocculating that soil because of this water, right? So I could get some additional calcium in to this situation and help counteract that SAR.
So in this case, the pHc is 8.3, so it's stripping calcium. Is that a big stripper, or is it a small stripper?
Relatively minor stripper, but again, we don't have a lot of concentration here in the first place, right? The TDS is 460, 467 on this stuff.
Yeah.
And so
bicarbonates are 121 and sulfates are 182, just so everybody kind of follows along with us. So there's a lot of sulfate. There's, you know, adequate amount of bicarbonates. It's not horrible, but it's certainly above what we would want to see as a threshold.
Now, what if, let's say, for instance, we had a balance of sodium and calcium in a water like this, and everything else was kind of the same. Well, I'd still say, hey, we have some sodium bicarbonate and we have some calcium sulfate. The pHc would also help us with that, because where would it would be higher than 8.4.
Right.
Okay. Hey, I got enough calcium. I don't need any more here. So again, when I come back to how would I treat this water, how would I help it? You know, gypsum injection, you know, it works, right? Get some getting some
calcium in
some
there.
calcium in that system. So when everybody, this is what drives me nuts, Joel, and this is what I wanted to get to, is it's become fashionable for our turfgrass scientists. I'm just going to not naming any names here.
Yeah, let's not.
Happening all over. You don't need calcium. Plant doesn't need calcium and all that sort of. We already know that's a non-issue.
Yeah,
right.
That's not true.
But when you're dealing with a water like this, that's bringing you all this sodium, literally in a course of a year, truckloads of it. I don't know if we figured out the whole thing, Kevin, but if you want to run the calculator for a second, 106 pounds per acre inch, do that for 400 acre feet.
Right.
So, why would we ignore the effects of a water like this? Why wouldn't we use all our tools to our advantage to treat it, especially on our high value, high maintained greens?
Yeah.
For instance, that are only, 120, 145,000 square feet, whatever it is. It's really not a hard thing to look at some additional applications and all that sort of stuff. And for anybody to say, hey, you're wasting your time, you're wasting your money and all that sort of stuff, it's the biggest amount of bullshit that I've ever heard. And the thing is when I press those guys, they'll tell me, well, except for in the case of water, that's different.
Oh, that's
which, if we go back to our original statement, it is your biggest input.
So what'd you figure out, Kevin? What did your calculator say?
So based on 400 acre feet, that's 508,000 pounds or 254 tons of salt going down on the ground.
254 tons.
So
that's 10 truckloads of that 10-wheeler that comes to deliver your fertilizer.
Yeah. How many people, by raise of hand, how many people would put this on their property every year?
Right.
Deliberately, anyway.
Yeah. Would you stack up, what did you say, Kevin? How many tons again?
250 roughly.
250. Would you stack up 250 tons, 250 pallets, right? Let's put it that way. Set it in your yard and say, here's my applications for the year, and nobody would notice.
Yeah.
I mean, you'd look at that pile every day and you go, holy shit.
I just put this on my property.
Holy shit, right? And I say to guys, okay, think about that. Think about that 300 tons, whatever it is, right? It's different for every water. And I said, just think about that sitting in front of your office window.
Right. When it's visual and you can see it and touch it, it really drives it home.
And on every pallet, it says, this is bad for you. This will hurt you.
Skull and crossbones all over. Let's put this out.
Exactly. Aren't you at a certain point going to say, man, I better combat this somehow? I may not win completely, but maybe if I change my techniques, maybe if I put some other, applications in my world, maybe if I look at some treatment.
Yeah.
All of those things.
Buffer the soil, bring in some carbon, flush a little bit more. We're running out of time, Dave. I just had a brilliant thought that I think we do this same conversation again. We find a different soil. I keep saying soil. A different water test, one that's much cleaner. This is a great one for the West Coast. The guys out on my side of the world probably are looking a little bit different. But let's do this.
I'd see this in Chicago. I'd see this.
Oh, absolutely. No question. But you'll also go down and see really, really clean waters. But there's a lot of things. Let's talk a little bit about, first of all,
everywhere. So
I completely agree. And like I said, I will always contend that bicarbonates and sodium are your first limiting factor. So I think this conversation is so incredibly important. Two things before we roll out. Tell the story of Coeur d'Alene that Kevin loves to tell so often, and explain that story, because I think it's such a powerful story, and it was water.
Well, Kevin, I don't know if I can tell it as well as you can. I mean, can I defer to you?
Sure.
Do it. Tell us the story, Kevin.
I mean, it was your golf course.
Yeah. So Dave was my consultant, and we had just pulled water and soil samples. We were going through them on the phone. And just for a little background, the conductivity is extremely low. There's very little other than hydrogen and oxygen in that water. And I wanted to learn more about it. And I said, okay. So of course I said, well, my pH is 7.1, so I'm really close to perfect. But we said, hey, talk to me about your cart paths. And I thought, what the hell difference does that make? I don't want to talk about my cart paths. I said, they're concrete cart paths. Golf course is 20 years old. What of it? He says, well, describe the cart paths. I said, well, there's cracks in them, yada, yada. You know, totally missed the point.
Yeah. Dave,
but then, but then when you asked me, do they look like exposed aggregate? And I said, you know what, as a matter of fact, they do. And he said, that's because your water is so hungry. You used that term earlier.
Hungry.
It's so hungry that it's stripping all the calcium out of the concrete in your paths. How's your soil doing on that? And boy, was that an aha moment for me.
And it will steal whatever it can. It has to find equilibrium, and that's what it was doing.
And again, I wasn't using 400 acre feet, but I was probably close to 200 in a year. So again, what was I doing? It was an easy fix in that case because you only had to, as you use the term, dirty it up a little bit.
Heavy it up. Yeah.
And we were good.
Yeah. And suddenly, but you see, because, what do they do when they're putting in, the fancy concrete finish is done with salt, right?
Yeah.
And all that is, you spread rock salt on the concrete, it pulls the calcium out of it, and they wash it away. And you have the little pits and all the little things, and ooh, cool, isn't this cool?
And
so,
and for a little more background,
right.
that was a snowpack runoff source of water, so that's why it was so clean.
Yeah, it was fine. Let's we're out of time here, Dave. But we're gonna do this again. We're gonna talk water again because I think it's such a valuable thing. But we've talked about this a couple times, and I hope people are still listening. They haven't hung up on us. But let's end by at least broaching the subject, and then we'll get into it the next go round on the idea that we've been throwing around of using reverse osmosis systems for spray tank usage. And we've talked a lot about this, and I think the three of us are in agreement that for a very small investment, this could make a really big impact on the on the efficacy of your spray water. And as you know, everything that we do at Earthworks, all of our liquids are built with reverse osmosis, because reverse osmosis means we're not going to have the chemical interference that we might have from some of the minerals that would be in the water when we're trying to load, in our case, 35 raw materials into a jug, which is all but impossible. We couldn't do it without RO water. But does it make sense that we broach this subject, and then again we can continue this conversation down the road? Give us your quick thought, and then I'm going to wrap you up.
Let's just hit it briefly, because I bet again, you go and hear a lot of people talk, and they want to talk about buffering pH in your spray tank. Yeah. And now that you've heard this whole big story about how pH can be so variable and it has different things and all that sort of thing, doesn't that make you wonder? Now, a lot of superintendents over the years have called me and said, which water source should I be using for my sprays, right? And especially now that we have, I know a few golf courses that are spraying fairways on a regular basis, and they have some fill stations out on the golf course into the irrigation system, and they'll say, "This is bad," to do that. And I kind of go, "Well, your irrigation water sucks."
Right. It's a polite word, but
yeah.
But your potable water at your shop is filled with chlorine. So I don't know. Let's see. Let's do the math and figure out which is the worst evil and get it out. So that's kind of how we did that. And so the conversation started coming up with some people about, should I be cleaning my water before I put it in the spray tank? In other words, I've got this 1,000-gallon tank here that now I'm mixing with. Should I buffer that first? Should I put some acid to that first and then mix my fungicides, or my fertilizers? And they're like, well, yes, that's a great way to do that. And for some people, buffering it or heavying it up or whatever, not a big deal. 1,000 gallons of water, half a bag of gypsum, let the agitators run. This is really great. For other people, it's virtually impossible to make that difference.
And it still hasn't removed any of the things that may be causing the pH.
Nothing's gone. The can of Coke is aspirated, right?
Right. Yeah.
It. So now we have access to RO systems that are relatively inexpensive. Because we're not talking about a huge capacity thing here. We're talking about a thing that needs to run relatively quick so you can fill up that mix tank,
right?
Or that loading tank, or I guess go directly into the sprayer. So that's kind of tough because you don't want to be standing there waiting, an hour to fill a 300-gallon sprayer. Everybody knows that's, madness.
Not going to happen. Yeah.
I certainly think, Joel, that when it comes to the efficacy of, and we know that we're not big fungicide people and all that sort of stuff, but the efficacy of whatever you're using, and particularly in your case, the biological or the carbon enhanced type things. I mean, here like you just said it, you go to all this trouble to use RO water when you're building your products, and then we dump them into this, gnarly water and go spray. I don't think we've ever seen, what could happen if we were to do that better.
Yeah. We've talked about this. I think for an investment of, and we'll leave this as the final tease, but a $5,000 investment, you can probably get a 2,000 gallon RO system and a 2,500 gallon tank. You could put that water in there and be ready to roll the next day. I mean, it makes perfect sense. And as Kevin said the other day, you compare that to the efficacy of any product, you'll save that $5,000 almost instantly.
Yeah,
it's no brainer in my mind.
Yeah, you think about the investment that folks in the Midwest and the East Coast make just in fungicides alone.
Yeah.
Right.
And we know that there's a direct correlation between the efficacy of those products and the water that they're loaded into. If we can improve that, the ROI is simple.
Yeah.
I was at a golf course in Mexico that uses RO water golf course wide, because that's the only source they get. Right. So they have to desalinate seawater essentially. Mm-hmm. And we built a couple of foliar sprays for this very simple ammonium sulfate oriented kind of thing with a little bit of carbon. And with the reverse osmosis with the desal water, like those sprays were way more effective than they were, across the border in San Diego with well water.
Yeah.
Right.
And it opened my eyes. I was like, oh man, maybe we should be fixing this. But I didn't take it all the way. It was, it was in the midst of a bunch of other stuff that we were doing. And it's like, later it's like, oh, that RO system is pretty cool.
Yeah.
That clean water to mix with is pretty cool.
Gentlemen, I love it. We've got a lot more to talk about. I think this idea of RO is going to continue. I hope it grows. It's a conversation to be had. But Dave, cannot thank you enough for your friendship, for your support. If you don't know Dave well, he is very involved in lots of things. He's been an independent consultant for over 30 years now or so, close to it. He's on Twitter. He's very active on TurfNet. And you can find him, Saturday mornings on the Turfgrass Zealot Project on YouTube?
Yeah, I've been doing this live thing, on YouTube. It's at Turfgrass Zealot is the YouTube channel. You can subscribe and get the notifications. Doesn't cost you anything, obviously. And I've been doing a Saturday morning show where I just kind of riff a little bit like what we're doing here. I've decided not to do guests. It's more of a solo monologue type thing. We may do guests down the road, but you guys are doing so good with that kind of thing. I wanted to do something a little different.
Let us do the good. You do Dave, which is always good.
And people show up for the chat on Saturday mornings, and then I make the thing available, later.
Yeah.
It's an evolving concept that I'm pretty excited about, just because I like doing it. It makes me happy.
Yeah.
The feedback we've been getting from golf course superintendents is pretty cool to just turn it on. You don't have to watch.
Right.
I might play a YouTube video or something. I know I did a little review on one of your 2-minute turf talks because I was so excited about it.
Yes, I remember. Thank you.
But, you could still put it in your ear. A young assistant told me the other day that he had it in his ears when he was out on the golf course. He just had YouTube running.
That's what the podcast is all about. Put it on while you're cutting grass.
Yeah. So, I built this little studio, and I'm just trying to have some fun with it, do some creative stuff. And, I started the podcast thing early, pretty early on for TurfNet when a lot of people were asking, what is a podcast? And, I just feel like as an early adopter of technology, I want to take that a little bit further, and make that my creative thing. So there it is.
And I've listened. It's been fun, and I've enjoyed it, and I think everybody else will. I also want to thank Kevin for hanging out with me today. But Dave, again, I can't thank you enough. We're going to have you back. We're going to talk about more water and other fun things that I think can be helpful. Like I said, you've been one of our most listened to podcasts, and I think you're going to now finally be able to get over your friend Armin Sooney on the So that's our goal in life. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us on the Earthworks podcast. We are here every week. Please subscribe to the podcast so that we can get you out notices. And gentlemen, I say thank you again. David, you're the best. And Kevin, thanks so much for being part of the team. And thank everybody for listening. Gentlemen, be good.